There are names that have been spoken for 1,000 years, passed from father to son, carved into church registries, whispered at baptisms, shouted across battlefields, and no one, not even the families who carry them, knows where they truly began. For centuries, surnames were treated as settled facts. A name told you where your people came from, what they did for a living, who their father was. It seemed simple, stable, written in stone. Then geneticists started reading a different kind of record, one written not in ink, but in the human Y chromosome, passed almost unchanged from father to son for generation after generation, the same way a surname is passed down in many cultures. And when researchers began comparing the two records side by side, something did not add up. Names that should have shared a single bloodline turned out to carry several. Names believed to be purely local turned out to carry signals from hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles away. Families who had told the same origin story for 10 generations discovered that their DNA was telling a different one entirely. This is the story of 14 such surnames, ordinary names, the kind you might see on a mailbox or a gravestone, and what their DNA revealed when scientists finally looked closely enough. It is a story about identity, about the fragile line between what we are told and what we actually are. And it begins with a simple, uncomfortable question: what if your name was never really about your ancestry at all? For most of European history, a surname was assumed to be a genetic anchor. Historians and genealogists built entire family trees on the premise that shared surnames meant shared blood. Church records, tax rolls, and parish registers were treated almost like genetic databases. If two men shared a name in the same village 3 centuries ago, they were presumed kin. This belief made sense on the surface. In much of Europe, hereditary surnames emerged between the 11th and 16th centuries, usually passed from father to son alongside land, trade, and title. A shared name often did mean a shared household, a shared village, sometimes a shared ancestor. Genealogists used this pattern to trace lineages backward for hundreds of years, confident that the name itself was a kind of fossil, a fixed marker of biological descent. It was a tidy system, and for a long time, no one had a reason to test it. But the first cracks appeared quietly, long before DNA entered the picture. Genealogists working with old parish records kept encountering the same strange pattern. Men with identical surnames, living in the same region, whose written family trees simply would not connect. No missing page could explain it. No plausible ancestor linked them. Sometimes the explanation seemed obvious. Adoption, remarriage, and illegitimate birth quietly absorbed into a family line. But the pattern appeared too often in too many unrelated surnames, in too many different countries, to be explained away as a handful of isolated incidents. Something about the assumption itself seemed to be cracking. Not the records, the premise. That is where genetics entered the story, and where the investigation became something closer to science than folklore. The tool that changed everything was the Y chromosome. Unlike most of our DNA, which reshuffles every generation in a genetic lottery, the Y chromosome is passed from father to son almost unchanged, generation after generation, with only slow, rare mutations accumulating over centuries. In cultures where surnames also pass from father to son, this created something remarkable: 2 inheritance systems, one written, one biological, running in parallel down exactly the same line. In theory, if surnames were reliable descent markers, men sharing a surname should also share a Y chromosome signature, tracing back to one founding ancestor. Researchers working in what became known as genetic genealogy began testing this directly, comparing the Y chromosome markers of men who shared a surname but no known family connection. The early results seemed to confirm the old assumption. Many rare and unusual surnames did cluster around a single, shared genetic signature. Evidence, researchers suggested, of a founding male ancestor whose descendants had simply spread out geographically while keeping the family name intact. For a moment, it looked like science was simply validating what genealogists had always believed. Then the data widened, and the story did not stay simple for long. If you enjoy this kind of quiet detective work, where ordinary records turn out to hide something much larger, consider subscribing because there is a lot more buried in the human past than most of us ever get told. As researchers tested more surnames, especially common ones, the tidy picture began to fracture. Instead of one dominant genetic line, many surnames showed several distinct, unrelated Y chromosome signatures existing side by side, sometimes going back many centuries. The name was singular. The ancestry beneath it was not. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. Genetic genealogists began referring to this phenomenon as non-paternity events, a clinical term for a very human reality. It did not always mean deception. It could mean informal adoption, a stepson taking a stepfather's name, a child raised by a mother's new husband, an orphan absorbed into a household and given its name out of care rather than blood. In some cases, it likely did reflect infidelity or hidden parentage. In others, it simply reflected how flexible and human the whole naming system had always been. What the DNA revealed was not scandal. It was complexity, the quiet, ordinary complexity of real human families operating for centuries under a system that pretended to be purely biological, but was, in practice, something closer to social and legal convention. This raised a deeper, more interesting question. If a shared surname did not always mean shared ancestry, what did the genetic patterns beneath these 14 names actually represent? Researchers began proposing several possible explanations, and, importantly, no single one applied to every case. The first explanation is straightforward: multiple, independent origins. Some surnames were not invented once by a single founder, but arose separately in different villages, coined by unrelated families who happen to describe the same trade, the same landscape feature, or the same physical trait. A name meaning Miller, or of the hill, or red-haired, could easily emerge in a dozen unconnected places at once. In these cases, the genetic diversity beneath the name was not a mystery to be solved. It was simply the honest signature of independent invention. The second explanation involves informal adoption and blended households. The pattern already described, quiet, human, and largely invisible in the written record, but clearly visible in the genetic one. The third, and by far the most unsettling for genealogists, is what researchers sometimes call a hidden admixture event. A moment, generations back, when a family's biological line quietly diverged from its recorded one, and the paper trail simply never noticed. Unlike simple non-paternity, this pattern sometimes carried genetic markers associated with populations far outside the region where the surname originated. Hints, researchers suggest, of migration, conquest, trade, or displacement folded invisibly into a family tree that looked, on paper, entirely local. Each of these explanations fit some surnames better than others. None of them fit all 14 equally. And that, researchers began to realize, was exactly the point. The assumption of a single clean answer had been the flaw from the beginning. The turning point came when researchers moved beyond individual family testing and began working with larger, population-scale genetic surveys, comparing surname clusters not just against each other, but against broader ancient and modern DNA reference panels drawn from across Europe and its neighboring regions. This was a different scale of evidence entirely. Instead of tracing one family's Y chromosome line in isolation, researchers could now ask a bigger question. Where across the deep history of European population movement, did these genetic signatures actually come from? The results were more layered than anyone expected. Several surnames long assumed to be purely regional, tied to a single valley, a single coastline, a single dialect, carried genetic markers more closely associated with populations hundreds of miles away, sometimes across what had once been considered firm cultural or linguistic boundaries. One name associated for centuries with a small inland farming community carried a Y chromosome signature more common along a distant coastal trade route. Another, tied by local legend to an ancient noble house, showed a genetic pattern more consistent with a much later and much more ordinary wave of agricultural laborers moving through the region during a period of resettlement. This was the moment the investigation stopped being about individual quirks and started feeling like something larger, a pattern of hidden movement written quietly into names that had always claimed to be local. Not the family stories researchers expected, not even the regions those stories pointed to. The surprise was not that ancestry had moved. Populations have always moved, mixed, and resettled. That part is not controversial. The surprise was where the signal pointed and how confidently the old stories had denied it. Names presented for generations as proof of deep, unbroken local roots were, in some cases, carrying evidence of comparatively recent arrival, absorbed so completely into local life that the record forgot it had ever been anything else. The genome was not erasing these family stories. It was revealing an older, messier one underneath them. This matters for reasons that go far beyond 14 surnames. For most of modern history, ancestry has been imagined as something like a river, a single clean channel flowing backward in time, unbroken, traceable, pure. Surnames reinforce that image perfectly. One name, one line, one origin. But human history has never actually worked that way. Populations split and rejoined. Villages absorbed strangers through marriage, war, trade, famine, and migration. Children were raised by men who were not their biological fathers, and no one wrote that down, because it did not need writing down. It was simply how families were built. Over enough centuries, the paper record and the biological record inevitably drift apart, not because anyone lied, but because human life is layered in ways that formal records were never designed to capture. What the DNA reveals is not that these families are less real, less rooted, or less legitimate than they believed. It reveals that the old model, one name, one bloodline, one origin, was always too small for what actually happened. Identity, it turns out, is rarely a single thread. It is a weave. Picture, for a moment, a village at dusk somewhere along an old European river valley, centuries before any of this could be tested or known. Smoke rising from low stone chimneys. A blacksmith's hammer falling somewhere in the distance. A child given a name that describes his father's trade, a name that will outlive him, outlive his children, and travel, quietly, invisibly, into a future none of them could have imagined, carried by descendants who will never know the true shape of what they inherited. Somewhere in that village, a stranger arrives, a traitor, a widow's second husband, a soldier who does not go home. No one records the moment as significant. It is just life, unfolding the way life always does, one ordinary decision at a time. And yet centuries later, that single unrecorded moment is the reason a name and a genome no longer agree. This is not a story about deception. It is a story about how much of history simply was not written down because it did not seem worth writing. If this kind of quiet, hidden history interests you, let me know in the comments which name or which population you think deserves this same investigation next. What the DNA ultimately reveals about these 14 surnames is not a scandal and is not a debunking. It is an expansion. The names are still real. The families who carry them are still connected to centuries of lived history, hardship, migration, and survival. What has changed is the shape of the story, from a single unbroken line to something closer to the truth of how human populations have always moved, mixing, absorbing, forgetting, and quietly carrying forward pieces of a past too complicated for any name to fully contain. Researchers remain cautious about overstating what any one genetic signature proves. A shared Y chromosome marker suggests a shared paternal line. It does not, on its own, prove where a name began or settle a family's identity once and for all. The evidence complicates the old story more than it replaces it, and in many cases, more testing and broader comparison will be needed before firmer conclusions can be drawn. But the mystery itself is the point. These 14 names were never simple. They were never single threads reaching backward through time to one clean origin. They were always braided, of migration and marriage, of trade routes and quiet secrets, of ordinary people making ordinary choices that outlasted them by 1,000 years. The map we were given was too small. The genome remembers more than the record ever did. And somewhere in the DNA of someone reading this right now, there's likely a name familiar, ordinary, worn smooth by generations of use, that is quietly carrying a history no one in that family has ever heard, waiting the way all forgotten things wait to finally be asked the right question.